Just pause the video and have a go at these 10 questions just to review your learning. And then if you pause the next slide as well, the answers are on the next slide. So we're going to take a look at the conducting system of the heart. So we've learnt about the cardiac cycle and the different phases of a heartbeat, I suppose. So how is that controlled? And that's what we're going to look at. So pause the video, have a read through the key learning points that we're going to cover with this video. So the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, is a section within the heart that beats itself. So it's a number of cells in the right atrium of the heart, and it basically sets the rate at which the heart beats, or at which the muscle within the heart contracts. So how does this work? Well, if you take a look, there is the SA node. So that's the right atrium, the wall of the right atrium. And the first thing that happens is that an impulse spreads from that SA node, and you can see the arrows that it's spreading out across the right and the left atrium, first of all. And that causes the atria to contract at the same time. And that's basically atrial systole. The second step is these impulses reach this node here called the AV node, or the atrioventricular node. And when they receive the impulses, those impulses are then passed down the center of the heart, the wall of the heart, and then they spread up through the left and the right ventricle. And as they spread through the walls of the left and the right ventricle, then that causes the ventricles to contract, which is ventricular systole. So you can see that there in the diagram on the slide. As these impulses spread through the heart and through the ventricles in particular, it's possible to detect these impulses because they generate a current that can be detected by a piece of equipment called an electrocardiogram, or an ECG. So on the right-hand side there is a diagram showing a normal ECG, or a normal cardiac cycle. So you can see we learned previously, didn't we, about the cardiac cycle normally on average taking about 0.8 seconds. So again, we can see that there from the 0 to the 0.8 seconds. And this is called a PQRST wave. Catchy, isn't it? So what is this? Well, we'll take a look at it in a bit more detail. So on the left-hand side is a normal cardiac cycle. And you can see what normal is compared to abnormal. There's 3 examples of abnormal there. I'm not going to go into detail about them, but I am going to talk about the normal wave in a little bit more detail. So the normal ECG of a normal cardiac cycle shows the PQRST wave. So the P wave, this initial bit here at 0.2 seconds, are the electrical impulses as they spread through the atria, and that's what causes atrial systole. So that part of the wave, in effect, is representing atrial systole, or contraction of the atria. The QRS wave is ventricular systole. So as these electrical impulses pass through the ventricles, this can be picked up here. And then finally, we've got the T wave at the end, and that's basically when the heart recovers during diastole. So you might be asked to calculate somebody's heart rate from an ECG. So my advice would be, look at the cardiac cycle, look at the PQRS wave, and find the points that are easier to read, and measure the distance between those 2 points. So if you take a look at the top here, we've got the PQRS wave there, and then the PQRS wave there. Now, to me, the easiest points to measure are between the ventricular systole in that particular cycle and ventricular systole in that particular cycle. And if you measure that, that's 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8. So you can calculate how long one cardiac cycle is in seconds. And if you divide 60 by the length of a cardiac cycle, then you'll be able to calculate somebody's heart rate. If that didn't make sense, pause, rewind, listen to what I've said again, and try and suss it out. So the heartbeat itself originates in the heart at the SA node, the sinoatrial node, which we've talked about. But it can be controlled and it can be regulated in 2 ways. First of all, by the nervous system, and then secondly, by hormones. So first of all, we're going to take a look at how the nervous system can help to control the heart rate. So the part of the brain that regulates heart rate is the medulla. And the autonomic nervous system controls heart rate. So in other words, it's autonomic, or automatic if you like. You don't have to think about it, it's subconscious. It happens without you having to give it any thought. So the autonomic nervous system is made up of a cardio accelerator center and a cardio inhibitor center. So if you break that down, cardio basically relates to the heart. Accelerator, if you think about a car, if you press the accelerator, it speeds the car up. Inhibitor, if you think about an inhibitor and what it does in terms of enzymes, well, it slows them down, or it stops them from working. So that's basically, there's like an accelerator and a brake, if you like, for the heart. And there are 2 nerves that run from the medulla in the brain to the pacemaker, or the SA node in the heart. One of them is called the sympathetic nerve, and one of them is called the parasympathetic nerve. And they are said to be antagonistic. And what that means is that they affect the same part of the body, but they have opposite effects. So the sympathetic nerve increases heart rate, and the parasympathetic nerve decreases heart rate. So if we think about the sympathetic nerve, first of all, if you have an increase in the number of nerve impulses passing down the sympathetic nerve from the medulla to the SA node, then that is going to release more of a chemical or a neurotransmitter called noradrenaline. And noradrenaline has the effect of increasing heart rate. If you increase the number of impulses passing down the parasympathetic nerve from the medulla to the SA node, then that increases the release of a neurotransmitter or a chemical called acetylcholine. And that has the opposite effect. That causes the heart to reduce its heart rate, or to decrease its heart rate. So just as a bit of a reminder about neurotransmitters, going back to National 5, remember electrical impulses pass down nerves or neurons, and then when they get to the end, there is a gap between one nerve and the next nerve, and that gap is called the synapse. And for impulses to pass across the gap, these chemicals held in vesicles need to be released into the synapse, and they move across the gap, and then they bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, and that causes an effect on this particular cell. So what we're seeing here is that there are these two nerves coming from the medulla. We've got the sympathetic nerve, the accelerator, and we've got the parasympathetic nerve, the brake or the inhibitor in effect. So if you have lots of impulses coming down here, down the sympathetic nerve, you get lots of this particular neurotransmitter called noradrenaline being released. The noradrenaline binds with the receptors, and when it does that, that causes the SA node to increase in its frequency, and so that increases the heart rate. The parasympathetic nerve is sending signals as well. If you increase signals down the parasympathetic nerve, that then releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. That travels across the gap, across the synapse, binds to the receptor, but the effect is opposite to the sympathetic, and it causes the heart rate to decrease. Hormones can have an effect on heart rate as well. So when we're exercising or when we're stressed, then the sympathetic nervous system has an impact or has an effect on the kidneys, on the adrenal glands. So there are nerve impulses being sent to the adrenal glands when we're stressed, and that causes them to release a hormone called adrenaline. And that adrenaline again gets released into the bloodstream. It travels through the blood, and it affects the SA node or the pacemaker, and it causes the pacemaker to generate more impulses at a higher rate, and that increases the heart rate. And that makes sense. If you're stressed or if you're exercising, if you're in a fight or flight situation, then the likelihood is that you're going to need more energy, you're going to need more glucose, you're going to need more oxygen delivered to your cells, and so your heart rate needs to increase. So just pause again, have a check of the key learning points, and if you've got any questions, speak to your teacher. We're just going to finish off with a little section on blood pressure. So we've talked about the cardiac cycle, we've talked about how it's controlled, but the blood pressure changes in the different phases of the cardiac cycle. So we're just going to have a look at that in just a little detail. So again, pause, have a look at the key learning points that we're going to cover. So it's a force. Blood pressure is the force that the blood exerts on the walls of the blood vessels as it travels through them. And it can be measured using a piece of apparatus called a sphygmomanometer. And blood pressure changes. So blood pressure changes as it moves through the circulatory system, as it moves from the arteries to the capillaries to the veins. We know that in the arteries, blood pressure is high, very high, because it's just left the heart. And as it travels through the circulatory system, blood pressure decreases. But blood pressure also changes in the different phases of the cardiac cycle as well. So during systole, when the heart is contracting, then blood pressure is higher than it is during diastole when the heart is relaxing. So that's why actually when you take your blood pressure, you have two readings. You'll have a reading for when the heart is contracting, when it's under systole, and you'll have a reading for when the heart is relaxing, when it's under diastole. So the average blood pressure of a young adult like myself is 120/80. So 120 being systole when the heart is contracting and the pressure is higher, 80 when the heart is relaxing and the pressure is a little bit lower. So again, we can just see it on this diagram. It's just demonstrating that as blood flows through the circulatory system, that the pressure decreases. So we've got aorta, it's left the heart in the aorta, travels through the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and you can see the trend of blood pressure decreasing as it travels away from the heart, and then as it travels through the capillaries and veins, it's very, very low at this point. It's trickling back into the heart. But you can also see that the blood pressure is different for systole and diastole. So if we look at the aorta, for example, if you look at the systolic pressure, we can see that it's up at 120 when the heart is contracting, and when the heart is relaxing, the pressure in the aorta goes down to 80. So you measure your blood pressure using a sphygmomanometer. So basically you put a cuff around your arm, inflate it, put air into it, and that basically blocks or stops the flow of blood through an artery. And then gradually the pressure is released in the cuff. It's gradually deflated until you can detect a pulse. And as soon as you can detect a pulse, that is your systolic pressure. And then the air is released a little bit more, it's deflated more. And when you can no longer hear the pulse, when you can no longer detect the pulse, as soon as that point happens, that's your diastolic pressure. And that's always lower than your systolic pressure. So if your blood pressure is above 140/90 for a period of time, then you are suffering from high blood pressure, or hypertension is the correct term for it. We're going to have a look in the next few lessons at what hypertension can cause, what are the consequences of hypertension, some of the diseases that result from it. But all you need to know for now are causes of hypertension, and there's a list given here of common factors that increase the chances of having hypertension. So again, pause and have a look at the key learning points. Go back and have a look at the video if parts didn't make sense. And if you've got any questions, just speak to your teacher. Use these learning points to help think what your questions are.